On a humid August night in 1968, the bustling streets of Bombay began to empty earlier than usual. Vendors packed their stalls quickly, families hurried indoors, and the city's thousands of pavement dwellers looked nervously over their shoulders as they prepared to sleep under the flickering street lights. In the slums and hutments of Malad, a suburb in Greater Bombay, the atmosphere was thick with more than monsoon humidity. It was heavy with fear. That night, as most of the city settled into an uneasy sleep, a figure moved silently through the narrow lanes between ramshackle shelters and makeshift homes. In his hand, he carried a hard, blunt instrument, an iron rod that would soon claim 2 more lives. Lashan Jagannath Yadav and Dula Jagi Yadav, 2 poor laborers sleeping in their modest dwelling in Chinchauli village, Malad, had no idea they were about to become the latest victims in a reign of terror that would earn their killer the moniker India's Jack the Ripper. The man with the iron rod was Raman Raghav, and by the time police finally captured him, he would confess to 41 brutal murders that had paralyzed one of India's largest cities with fear. His victims had one thing in common. They were all among Bombay's poorest residents, the invisible population that slept on pavements and in slums, defenseless against a predator who struck without warning or apparent motive. Raman Raghav became known as Jack the Ripper of India after committing more than 40 brutal murders in Mumbai from 1965 to 1968. Unlike his British counterpart, who targeted prostitutes in Victorian London's East End, Raghav preyed on victims who were poor and mostly sleeping on the sidewalk. His killing spree would transform Bombay from a city that never slept into one where the homeless feared to close their eyes. What made Raman Raghav particularly terrifying was not just the brutality of his crimes, but their apparent randomness. His victims included men, women, and children, killed in motiveless murders that defied conventional criminal logic. In just 3 years in the 1960s, Raman's killing spree forced the complete shutdown of a city, with people preferring to stay indoors rather than being bludgeoned to death by him. The terror began in earnest in 1965, though the full extent of Raghav's crimes wouldn't become clear until years later. A series of similar murders had taken place in 1965-66 in the eastern suburbs of Bombay, where 19 people had been attacked. These initial attacks set a pattern that would define the entire killing spree. Slum dwellers and the poor, in derelict hutments, isolated shanties and pavements, were killed by having their skulls bashed in with a hard and blunt instrument. Raghav's modus operandi was consistent and terrifyingly simple. In the midnight hours, he used to bash the head of victims with an iron rod. He killed his victims when they were sleeping by hitting them with a hard and blunt object. As his victims either lived on the pavements or in ramshackle huts, it was not difficult for the killer to approach the victims. The methodical nature of these attacks revealed a killer who understood the vulnerabilities of his chosen prey. Bombay's pavement dwellers, migrant laborers, and slum residents represented the city's most defenseless population. They had no security guards, no locked doors, no protection beyond their own vigilance. For Raghav, they were perfect victims, isolated, unprotected, and unlikely to be immediately missed. What made the investigation particularly challenging was Raghav's modus operandi. Bludgeoning victims while they slept left little forensic evidence, hindering identification and linking the crimes. The randomness of his victim selection further complicated the investigation, making it difficult to establish a pattern or profile. The police found themselves dealing with an entirely new type of criminal. Traditional motives, revenge, robbery, passion, seemed irrelevant. The victims had nothing worth stealing, no connections to each other, and no apparent relationship with their killer. This was motiveless murder on a scale that Indian law enforcement had never encountered. As 1966 progressed, the attacks continued with terrifying regularity. Each morning brought new reports of battered bodies discovered in slums, on pavements, and in the makeshift shelters that housed Bombay's poorest residents. The killer seemed to possess an intimate knowledge of where the vulnerable slept and when they would be most defenseless. The psychological impact on the city was profound. Bombay's pavement dwellers, already living on the margins of society, found themselves completely abandoned to terror. Many stopped sleeping outdoors altogether, crowding into already overcrowded shelters or simply staying awake through the night. The social fabric of the slums began to unravel as neighbors became suspicious of each other, and communities that had provided mutual support descended into paranoia. By 1967, the killings had created a humanitarian crisis. Social workers reported that homeless populations were fleeing certain areas of the city, creating refugee-like conditions as people sought safety in numbers. The railway stations, traditionally places where the destitute could find some shelter, became war zones of competition for the safest sleeping spots. The police investigation was hampered not only by the lack of forensic evidence, but also by the social invisibility of the victims. Many of the dead were migrants with no permanent address, no family in the city, and no one to immediately report them missing. Some bodies went undiscovered for days, further complicating efforts to establish timelines and collect evidence. The initial police investigation into the first wave of incidents between 1965 and 1966, involving 19 individuals with 9 fatalities, faced significant hurdles. Without modern forensic techniques, DNA analysis, or sophisticated criminal profiling, investigators were essentially working blind, trying to catch a killer who struck randomly and disappeared without trace. The breakthrough came not through detective work, but through sheer persistence and a stroke of luck. In 1968, police finally arrested Raman Raghav in connection with the murders of Lashan Jagannath Yadav and Dular Jagi Yadav at Chincholi village, Malad, Greater Bombay. However, getting him to confess to the full extent of his crimes would prove almost as challenging as catching him. For a long time, Raghav refused to answer questions. However, he began to answer their questions after the police fulfilled his request for dishes of chicken to eat. He then gave a detailed statement describing his weapon and his modus operandi. This confession would reveal the true scope of his crimes and provide investigators with their first real insight into the mind of India's first documented serial killer. The confession was both illuminating and disturbing. Raghav described his crimes with a matter-of-fact detachment that chilled even experienced police officers. He admitted to 41 murders, describing how he would select victims, approach them as they slept, and kill them with swift, brutal efficiency. What emerged was a picture of a predator who viewed human life as utterly worthless and killing as a routine activity. The psychological evaluation that followed the arrest revealed that Raghav suffered from paranoid schizophrenia. This diagnosis provided some context for his crimes, but raised difficult questions about criminal responsibility and mental illness. The case would become a landmark in Indian legal history's treatment of mentally ill defendants. When the trial started in the Court of Additional Session Judge, Mumbai, on June 2, 1969, the counsel for defense made an application that the accused was incapable of defending himself on account of unsoundness of mind. This plea initiated a lengthy legal process that would examine the relationship between mental illness and criminal culpability in ways Indian courts had rarely addressed before. The trial revealed additional disturbing details about Raghav's methods and mindset. Witnesses described a man who seemed to derive no pleasure from killing, but also showed no reluctance to murder. He appeared to view his victims as objects rather than people, showing the complete absence of empathy that characterizes psychopathic behavior. The weapon Raghav used, a blunt object like an iron rod or stone, to bludgeon his victims to death while they were sleeping or resting in public places. He struck swiftly and silently, leaving no chance for his victims to defend themselves, became a symbol of his methodical approach to murder. Unlike crimes of passion or even calculated murder for gain, These were purely functional killings carried out with industrial efficiency. The geographical pattern of the murders also revealed significant insights into Raghav's psychology and planning. He concentrated his attacks in areas where he was familiar with the terrain, the population, and the police patrol patterns. This suggested that despite his mental illness, he retained enough rational thought to plan his crimes and avoid capture for years. The social implications of the case extended far beyond criminal justice. Raghav's choice to target society's most vulnerable members highlighted the extreme inequality and social abandonment that characterized 1960s Bombay. His victims were people society had already failed: migrants seeking work, disabled individuals unable to support themselves, and families driven to homelessness by poverty. The case also marked a turning point in Indian criminal investigation. The sheer scale of the murders and the challenge of tracking a serial killer forced police departments to develop new approaches to evidence collection, victim identification, and interjurisdictional cooperation. Raghav's crimes essentially created the template for modern serial killer investigation in India. The psychological profile that emerged from the case influenced how Indian law enforcement approached subsequent serial crimes. The sheer randomness and callousness of his murders, earning him the moniker Psycho Raman, demonstrated that motiveless killing was possible and required different investigative approaches than traditional criminal cases. The media coverage of the case was unprecedented for its time. Newspapers struggled to explain the concept of serial killing to a public unfamiliar with such crimes. The sensational nature of the story, combined with its challenge to conventional understanding of criminal behavior, made Raghav one of India's first celebrity criminals. The impact on Bombay's homeless population was lasting and profound. Even after Raghav's capture, many pavement dwellers remained reluctant to sleep in isolated areas. The collective trauma of the killing spree changed migration patterns within the city and influenced where the poor sought shelter for years afterward. From a criminological perspective, the Raghav case provided India's first detailed study of serial killer psychology. His diagnosis of paranoid schizophrenia, combined with his systematic approach to murder, challenged simple equations between mental illness and criminal behavior. The case demonstrated that severe mental illness could coexist with calculated criminal planning. The legal proceedings also established important precedents regarding mental competency and criminal responsibility. The courts had to balance public safety concerns with the rights of mentally ill defendants, creating frameworks that continue to influence Indian criminal law today. Raghav died on April 7, 1988. While still in custody, having spent 2 decades institutionalized after his conviction. His death marked the end of a case that had fundamentally changed how India understood serial crime, mental illness, and the vulnerabilities of urban poverty. The victims of Raman Raghav, 41 individuals whose names have largely been forgotten by history, represented the ultimate tragedy of social invisibility. They were killed not for who they were, but precisely because of who they were not. People without status, protection, or anyone to seek justice on their behalf, their killer achieved a kind of immortality through his crimes, becoming the subject of books, documentaries, and films, including Anurag Kashyap's 2016 movie Raman Raghav 2, the real-life killer Raman Raghav, who operated in Mumbai during the 1960s, inspired the film. Yet this attention has done little to address the social conditions that made his crimes possible. Today, decades after Raghav's reign of terror, Mumbai still struggles with homelessness, urban poverty, and the social invisibility of its most vulnerable residents. The case of Raman Raghav serves as a reminder that serial killers don't emerge in a vacuum. They exploit existing social fractures and prey on those whom society has already failed to protect. The legacy of India's Jack the Ripper lies not just in the fear he created or the lives he took, but in what his crimes revealed about a society that allowed its most vulnerable members to live and die in the shadows. The police investigation took 3 years to identify Raghav as the killer, but the social investigation into why such crimes were possible has yet to reach any definitive conclusions. In the humid nights of modern Mumbai, as the city's homeless population still seeks shelter under bridges and on pavements, the spectre of Raman Raghav serves as a dark reminder that monsters can emerge from the intersection of mental illness, social abandonment, and urban anonymity. His story remains one of India's most chilling criminal cases, precisely because it forces us to confront uncomfortable truths about whose lives matter and whose society chooses to protect. The iron rod that Raman Raghav used to kill 41 people has long since been locked away as evidence, but the conditions that made his crimes possible, extreme poverty, homelessness, and social invisibility, continue to define life for millions in India's cities. His case stands as both a historical crime story and an ongoing social indictment, proving that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are those that society itself creates through neglect, abandonment, and indifference.